Hey friends, today's episode is brought to you by some dear friends of mine over at Shudder. With Halloween approaching, there's no better time to immerse yourself in Shudder's considerable collection of creepy content, which features some of the best scary movies and TV shows ever created. To celebrate the spookiest night of the year, Shudder has announced their Home for Halloween collection, which includes two original documentary series called The 101 Scariest Horror Moments of All Time and Queer for Fear, The History of Queer Horror. New editions Deadstream and Dark Glasses are looking very promising, but the 101 Scariest Horror Moments is what I'm most looking forward to. I always have such trouble in deciding what to watch, and it'll really help me decide on what horror movies line up during the countdown to All Hallows Eve. As a special Samhain treat, Shudder has given me a unique promo code that buys you guys a 30-day Shudder subscription completely free of charge. Just go to shudder.com and enter the promo code Let's Read when prompted, then get started on watching the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content around. Whether it's classic horror films or modern must-sees like VHS 94 or the legendary Greg Nicotero's Creepshow TV series, Shudder is bound to make your Halloween one of all treats and no tricks. I've always hated Halloween. No offense to anyone that enjoys it, but all the imagery brings back some very traumatic memories for me, and I tend to turn into a total homebody and order a lot of takeout around the end of October each year. My phobia is rooted in something that happened one Halloween back when I was a kid, and ever since, seeing all the pumpkins and skeletons in creepy costumes every year reminds me of all the fear and confusion I felt that night. Back in October of 1995, I just started 5th grade, and I was very excited about Halloween. My best friend's parents had agreed to take me and her trick-or-treating after school, and after taking us to a Halloween store that previous weekend to buy costumes, myself and Kayla were super excited to put them to good use. For some reason, we chose to wear black garbage bags with holes cut in them for dresses because we figured that that's what witches would wear. Then we painted our faces green, put on these black pointy hats that we picked up, then did a lot of cackling around this little plastic cauldron we'd insisted that Kayla's mom buy us. Once we were all ready to leave, Kayla's mom walked us around the neighborhood, and we managed to collect a ton of candy before we decided enough was enough. After that, we walked back to Kayla's house, then sat in front of the TV watching The Simpsons while we ate our candy. I have this vivid memory of it being one of those Treehouse of Horror episodes, and it was one where they're doing a Nightmare on Elm Street parody with groundskeeper Willie playing Freddy Krueger. It's weird because those moments before all the horror started, I think they were some of the happiest of my childhood. Or maybe it's just that they just mark a kind of threshold of innocence, me going from all happy-go-lucky and carefree to realizing that the world is a much darker place than TV sitcoms makes out. I'm not sure what the next show on the TV was because right after The Simpsons ended, Kayla's mom walked into the room to stop us gorging ourselves on candy. Kayla's dad was already home by that point, and as her mom helped us decide what our 2 final pieces of candy would be before it all got stored away, the doorbell rang. I remember Kayla's mom calling out to her dad, asking him to see to the door because she was busy. Then I carried on trying to decide if I wanted my last 2 pieces to be Milk Duds and Lemon Heads or M&Ms and a Butterfinger. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. Even though it was just 10 feet away from us, I didn't pay any attention to what was going on at the door, not until I heard Kayla's dad growl something like, "What are you doing?" He sounded angry, and I could hear some commotion coming from the hallway as Kayla's mom got up to see what was going on. The next thing, she absolutely screeches out Kayla's dad's name, Ron. Kayla's dad yells for her to call the cops. Then Kayla's mom starts wailing at me and Kayla to run upstairs to Kayla's room. The layout of their house meant that we had to briefly walk into the hallway in full view of the front door in order to get to the stairs, and as much as Kayla's mom tried to block us from seeing what was happening on the front step, I caught a glimpse before we scrambled up the steps and into Kayla's room. Her dad was wrestling with a person whose face I couldn't see. There was blood, and something shiny in the faceless man's hand. The panic of seeing what was happening propelled me and Kayla up the stairs, and by the time we slammed her bedroom door closed and dived under her bed, we were both in floods of tears. All we heard for the next few minutes was yelling and shouting from Kayla's mom and dad. Her mom sounded terrified, and we could hear what she was saying to the 911 operator, how a man in a mask had just tried to stab her husband. But then her husband's yells were nothing like I've ever heard before. He sounded savage, almost inhuman, and his words sounded more like barks, and I couldn't make out anything he said aside from a few curses. I remember being terrified, but the sound made Kayla sound so frightened that she started pulling at her hair and saying, "I don't want my dad to die. Please, God, don't let him die." I remember how heartbreaking it was to see Kayla wrenching at her own hair. I tried to do my best to comfort her, but as I did, I heard Kayla's mom whining, "Ron, what have you done?" After that, I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could hear a man and a woman talking much quieter than they had previously, still urgent but not screaming or yelling or inhuman roaring like before. I was desperate to go make sure Kayla's dad is okay to reassure her, and since the volume of voices seemed to indicate that the situation had improved, I figured that I'd go check it out so I could report back to Kayla, who was almost catatonic with fear by that stage. So I crawl out from under the bed, open up the bedroom door, and step out onto the landing so I can peek down the stairs. Again, I only caught a glimpse before both of Kayla's parents screamed at me to get back in the bedroom, but Kayla's dad seemed to be okay, and the man that I realized had a mask on was lying still on the floor at his feet. I was so relieved that Kayla's dad was okay that I didn't really think about the masked man just lying there. I just went back to Kayla and told her that her dad was okay. I didn't want to say everything was fine. I knew whatever was happening was still, ongoing. But I could at least confirm that her worst fears hadn't come true, and that she didn't have to worry about her dad being dead. I think Kayla's mom realized we needed to be kept up in that bedroom to keep us from seeing what had happened, so she joined us maybe only a minute later to reassure Kayla that her dad was okay. She said everything was going to be fine and that everyone was okay, but we needed to stay up in the bedroom until we were told it was okay to come out. Kayla said that she wanted to talk to her dad, but her mom said that he was busy talking to the cops. Then she told us that they had caught the bad man, and that was the word she used, caught, and that the police officers were on their way to collect him. And that was why we had to be kept safe upstairs. Obviously, I already seen the guy laying there at the feet of Kayla's dad, but just hearing that someone who'd tried to hurt us was downstairs was really, really scary to me. And even though we didn't need any help being kept in Kayla's bedroom, her mom carried the small TV/VHS combo in from their bedroom so we could watch movies. She returned shortly after with the rest of our Halloween candy and told us that we could eat as much as we liked. Then, after she told me that she'd call my parents to let them know what had happened, we didn't see her again for a few hours. It's not like we calmed right down again after such a horrifying ordeal. We were still really freaked out, and no amount of candy was going to make us forget about what we'd seen. But Kayla's dad appeared at one point to reassure us that everything was okay, having obviously changed his clothes, and her mom kept checking on us every 15 minutes or so to answer any questions that we had. Granted, most of her answers were little white lies intended to keep us from getting too scared, but it all helped us to stay calm enough to eventually drift off when the inevitable sugar crash came. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do have a fuzzy memory of being woken up by my parents sometime later, with my dad carrying me to his car before driving us home again. Both me and Kayla were kept out of school the next day, and if her day went anything like mine, it started with a very sanitized explanation of the previous night's events. The way my parents explained it, an intruder had attempted to enter Kayla's home, and Kayla's dad had simply defended himself. They said although it had been very frightening, and it was very sad that someone was hurt, Kayla's dad had done the right thing in keeping us all safe, so everything was okay. The reality was a little less sunny, and the whole truth trickled down to us over the years, and here's everything I know now. The masked man was the husband of the woman that Kayla's dad was having an affair with. The same woman later said that she didn't believe her husband had actually wanted to hurt Kayla's dad and had only intended to scare him, but that's not what happened on the doorstep. Kayla's dad later told a judge that upon seeing the guy step towards him with a knife in his hand, he'd instinctively tried to shove him to buy him time to safely get back in the house. The guy responded by raising the knife, and somehow Kayla's dad had gotten cut. Kayla's dad claimed that he had very little memory of what happened next, and said his only thought was for the protection of his family. Kayla's mom, on the other hand, she had to testify in court that although she hadn't actually witnessed her husband getting stabbed, he definitely had blood leaking from a cut to his arm as he basically beat the masked man to death right there on their doorstep. He overpowered him, pinning him down, and then bashed his head against the stones until he wasn't moving anymore. The judge eventually threw out all the charges on the grounds that Kayla's dad was defending himself and his family, and this coincided with us kids being told that everything was going to be fine. But everything wasn't fine. Kayla's mom had witnessed her husband take the life of the man whose marriage he had violated. Sure, he'd protected them, but only from something he'd created in the first place. Needless to say, their marriage was never the same after that, and as it slowly fell apart over the following years, I had to watch it having a terrible effect on Kayla. They ended up getting a divorce, with her dad keeping the house while her mom got custody. But then, instead of finding somewhere to live around town, Kayla's mom decided to take her down to Florida so she could be closer to her grandparents. He had one last summer together. Then, by the time I started my freshman year of high school, Kayla was gone. It was sad, really sad, and although I moved on, I never forgot her. For a long, long time, we didn't talk or keep in touch, but then Facebook happened, and the only reason I created a profile in the first place was specifically to search for Kayla. I ended up finding her, and we had a very emotional catch-up after exchanging cell phone numbers, and eventually the conversation turned to that Halloween night back in 1995. That's when I got the full story of everything that had happened, and why it suddenly made so much sense when I heard Kayla's mom saying in that terrified voice, "Ron, what have you done?" Ron hadn't just killed a man. He destroyed 2 families in the process. I'm not excusing what the knife man did, but none of it ever needed to happen in the first place. But I guess that's just not the world we live in. Back when I was still a junior in high school, me and my cousin used to volunteer with the local church, and every Halloween, we'd act as chaperones for the younger kids so they could trick-or-treat in safety. It was a pretty good gig, if I'm honest. Most people whose homes you stop at recognize you were the chaperone and offer you a piece of candy or two, which meant you could still cop some free candy despite being way too old and out of costume. We'd been chaperones during our sophomore year, so we knew how much free candy you could get, and since we didn't have anything better to do on the next year's Halloween, me and my cousin figured we'd volunteer again. Just like the first year, we took charge of about 4 third graders each, then walked them around the neighborhood, knocking at any houses that had decorations outside. We head up this one cul-de-sac and we start working our way around the circle of houses when I notice an older kid sitting on the porch of a house across from us. He was maybe about 12 or 13, older than the kids we had with us, but definitely younger than we were, and he's just mad-dogging us from across the street. He did not look happy to see us there at all, and I even gave my cousin a nudge to be like, "What's that kid's problem?" We agreed to maybe not knock at that kid's house on the way out of the cul-de-sac, as we definitely didn't want some sort of confrontation occurring, but in the meantime, we could still knock at other homes so the kids could get some candy. My group had just finished up at one home and was in the process of leapfrogging my cousin's group when I heard a snapping sound coming from the other side of the street. Having not recognized what the sound was, I had no urgency about me as I turned to see where it was coming from. But when I did, I could feel the blood draining from my face. The angry-looking kid from the other side of the street was in the middle of reloading one of those break-barrel air guns and I started to panic as I realized that he might have hit one of the kids in my group. And that's when the screams started. My head whips around to see a little girl who's in the middle of unleashing the most ear-splitting scream I'd ever heard. She's pointing at another kid, one dressed as the blonde girl from that Frozen movie, who had a hand over her eyes with blood dripping out from underneath it. I remember going to complete panic mode. Not so much because the kids were hurt, or even that her injury seemed like it was really bad. It was because I'd already seen the kid reloading. He didn't just shoot and run away. He wanted to keep shooting. My first thought was to tell the kids to run for cover, but before I could even get a word out, they were scattering in different directions. Meanwhile, my cousin had been wise enough to the kid shooting pellets at us from the moments he fired the first shot, and the kid only barely got another pellet into the barrel before my cousin just slammed into him. Both of them were sprawled out on the ground for a second. Then just before I ran away to help, my cousin wrenches the air gun away from the kid and starts beating the life out of him. I mean, absolutely knocking the snot out of this kid over and over again. What came next was just total chaos. People were coming out of their houses, drawn by the sound of the screams. Most didn't seem to know what was going on, and even tried to get my cousin off the shooter before he started yelling back at him about how he was the one who'd stopped the shooting. The cops took way too long to show up because there was no initial reports of gunshots or anything. That, and I guess they were super busy with it being Halloween. The EMTs showed up first, and it was while the little Frozen girl was being treated that I learned her injuries weren't that bad. I thought the little pellet the kid had fired had taken the poor thing's eye out. It turns out, it had struck her just around her eyebrow, and although there was a nasty gash, she hadn't been blinded, thank God. Once the injured girl had been taken off to the hospital and I had made about a dozen phone calls to a dozen different people, I finally led the kids back to our church, leaving my cousin to wait for the cops while still sitting on the shooter. My cousin said the whole time his biggest worry was the shooter's kids' parents appearing, but he was in that cul-de-sac for just over an hour, and not only did they not show up, but no one seemed to know who or where they were. He told me that after the cops arrived, they arrested the kid, asked him a few questions, and he passed on my cell number so they could talk to me too. I didn't realize it until talking to them, but I don't think I'd taken the time to properly process what had happened. So as I was breaking down what I'd seen before the kid fired, I ended up breaking down too. Like I said, the shooter was only maybe 12 or 13 years old, meaning he probably is either in juvie or some kind of program as I'm writing this. I know kids his age can be mindlessly and thoughtlessly cruel, and that in opening fire on that little Frozen girl, he hadn't properly thought through his actions. But I remember being that age, and I can't imagine having the hatred or malice in me to do anything like shoot an air gun at a little girl's head. It's no surprise to me that his parents weren't around, and I'm not trying to excuse his actions, but I've always wondered what the kid's home life was like for him to even think about hurting someone like that. I hope he was punished, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, I hope that kid gets the help he needs. Not so much because I feel particularly bad for him, which to be fair I do, is because if he doesn't get help, that little girl might not only be the innocent young female he ends up hurting. I've been a police officer for the last 7 years, and for 3 of them, I worked as part of an emergency response team in a busy London borough. One Halloween, we drove over to a suspected domestic violence incident in a block of flats. The informant was a woman who was in the middle of taking her kids trick-or-treating when suddenly they heard screaming and fighting coming from one of the flats. Domestic disturbances like that are a depressingly common occurrence sometimes, and they can obviously make for very volatile situations. So as me and a colleague drove over to the address, there were quite an intense feeling of apprehension in the car. We had no idea at the time, but the encounter we were about to have would become a bit of a legend back at the station, and is something I've never really ever been able to properly explain. Once we arrived at the address, my colleague and I walked up a few flights of stairs, found the flat that the disturbance was coming from, then knocked on the door. I hadn't heard anything on my way up the stairs and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from inside once we were at the door. There was a good chance that things had simply died down, but that didn't mean that we didn't have to follow up with a welfare check and some questions. After knocking twice, we had no response, and it didn't look like we were going to get to talk to anyone from the property, so my colleague left me to go downstairs and speak directly to the informant. While he does that, I thought I'd be able to get one of the neighbors to talk to me, but right as I'm about to buzz the next flat over, the door of the address we'd been given opens up, and this old lady comes to the door. It was only coming up at 10 p.m., but we'd clearly woken her up with our knocking, and she was naturally alarmed to see me standing outside. I told her that someone had called saying that they could hear a disturbance coming from within her address. I asked her if there was anyone else inside with her, and she looked bemused and told me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. Confused, I then radioed my colleague to double-check if I was calling at the right place. Then, when he confirmed that I was at the right one, I figured that I'd dig a little bit deeper. I asked the little old lady if I could pop into her flat for a minute so I could have a look around and make sure no one was there. She tells me, of course, that I'm more than welcome to have a look around, but when I walk inside, the flat is in almost complete darkness apart from her hall light and her bedside lamp. I begin searching through the flat just to be on the safe side. My big fear was that someone had broken in, then had threatened to hurt her if she didn't tell us everything was okay. So once I eliminated my own personal worst nightmare, I decided we'd just move on and wait for any additional calls. Then, right as I'm about to leave, my colleague called me up on the radio. He sounded a bit flustered as he told me that he was on his way back up, then asked me if everything was okay. I'm obviously very confused as he seemed to be acting like I was in trouble when everything was just fine. He then told me that there had been a second 999 call from one of the flat's neighbors, and they too could hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was in. I just stood there for a moment, listening to nothing but silence, while feeling this weird chill creeping up my spine. There had to have been a mistake. There just had to be, because although we got our second call stating that there was an ongoing disturbance occurring, I was in the flat itself, and I couldn't hear a bloody thing. Once I'd actually confirmed that nothing was going on, we left shortly afterwards, having made a point of apologizing to the elderly woman for waking her. The week between Halloween and Bonfire Night tends to be a very busy time for us for obvious reasons, so it wasn't like we had too long to sit and reflect on what had just happened. And the next thing we knew, we were off chasing some teenagers who responded to a rejected trick-or-treat attempt with broken windows. It was only much later on, when the night had quieted down a bit, that we started to go over what had happened back at the flats and why exactly the whole thing felt really creepy. The next time I was on shift, I was immediately greeted by a colleague who asked me, "So what did the ghost look like then?" Everyone was joking that we just visited a haunted house, with some genuinely more convinced on it than others. I don't believe in any of that, but sometimes I wonder just what was happening to make people complain of screams inside that flat, when in reality, the place was as quiet as the grave. Okay, so I'm not exactly a 911 dispatcher, but I work very closely with them, although they'd never actually know it. For the past 4 or 5 years now, I've worked as the IT guy for a law enforcement agency, and it's my job to bring up specific 911 calls wherever there's a big incident or a legal request coming in. I would listen to the calls to make sure that we got all the correct radio traffic, which would of course mean that I had to listen to all or most of the call. I also did this to make sure that we had the right 911 call that was being requested for review. The one that sticks out to me happened about a year into my job, on Halloween night of 2009. I was actually repairing some equipment in our dispatch center when the call came in and had to immediately pull the recordings as we all knew it would have been requested. I listened to it all happen and did my best to assist. A 12-year-old boy called in hysterical and asked for an ambulance because his mom was shot. We of course dispatched immediately, but they were in the middle of nowhere and the closest ambulance was 30+ minutes away. As the call continued, we got him to tell us what had happened. The kid was all set up to go trick-or-treating, and for whatever reason, he decided that his dad's gun would tie it all together. It was an older style bolt-action rifle with no safety and an extremely light trigger pull. He had just pulled it out of the case and accidentally hit the bolt on the side of the table, which caused the gun to fire. The bullet went through the bedroom wall, into the kitchen, and hit the mom in the stomach, all while she was standing less than 30 feet away. I don't know where the dad was, but he wasn't home when this all happened, so the dispatcher had to direct the son on how to stop the bleeding. Listening to that call was honestly the most terrifying, traumatic, and heart-wrenching few moments of my life. At first, you could faintly hear the mom in the background saying stuff like, "It's okay. You didn't mean it. It's okay. I love you." She just kept repeating the stuff over and over while the son was sobbing and giving us all the info as we tried to assist. Towards the end of the call, the son was shouting over and over, "Mama. God, Mama, I'm so sorry, Mama, don't die, Mama, Mama, please." As far as I know, she was gone long before the ambulance ever arrived. The dispatcher I work with managed to stay cool while I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and they worked like a well-oiled machine during the whole call, but sadly, I don't think that story came with a happy ending. Dispatchers truly are the unsung heroes. The emotional and mental toll that it takes on people that do the job is crazy. I know for a fact that I couldn't do it. I'm just not emotionally tough enough. But that just makes me all the more grateful for those that are. When I was just 9 years old, my parents drove me over to my friend's house so I could go trick-or-treating with them and a few of our elementary school friends. I remember having dinner there and being told that after we'd eaten, we'd change into our costumes, then head out for trick-or-treating. As soon as we finished dinner, my friends asked me if I wanted to go see his dog. I say sure, and then we all head out into the backyard to be greeted by this big black Chow Chow. Now, for those that don't know your dog breeds, Chow Chows are the kind with fluffy faces and little ears that kind of make them look like teddy bears. Some of them can grow to be pretty big, and given how small that I was at 9 years old, that black Chow Chow seemed very big to me. My friend asked if I wanted to pet him, and although I remember being scared, I didn't want to seem like a wuss in front of them. So, hesitantly, I reached down very slowly to pet the dog. They say that dogs can smell fear, and I don't know if it was me moving so slow or the fact that he could smell how nervous I was, but in a split second, the dog went from all calm and docile to growling and biting at my arm. I started moving backwards, trying to get away, but the dog leapt forward and brought its jaws down just above my wrist. I just remember screaming in pain, and how nothing any of my friends did got the dog to loosen its grip on me. They tried their best, but weirdly, it was only when my friend's mom saw what was happening and ran out to throw a jug of cold water over the dog that it actually let go. After that, there was a huge rush around me as my friend's mom carried me into the kitchen to start treating my wound, and around that time I remember starting to feel really strange. My arm suddenly seemed to stop hurting, and although there must have been a ton of adrenaline in my system, I felt weirdly at ease. I'd left a big trail of blood from the backyard into the kitchen, and everyone was crying. Even my friend's mom was struggling to keep it together while calling 911. But there I was, just all zen about it, just thankful that the dog didn't bite my arm off, which I think was my deepest fear in the moment itself. If I still had my arm, everything would be okay, right? And while that was technically correct, I still had a terrible time when it came to recovering. All in all, I had 7 deep cuts, 3 on the inside of my forearm, 4 on the outside of it, and this meant a total of 20 stitches up and down my arm. The doctors told my parents that the size of my arm compared to the dog's jaws meant that I was lucky a major artery hadn't been pierced, in which case I really would have been in trouble. Needless to say, no one ended up trick-or-treating that night. The dog wasn't taken away by animal control or anything. I grew up in a small town with quite a tight-knit community, and it was all understood to be just a horrible accident. I didn't end up playing at that kid's house anymore though, and I'm still kind of nervous around dogs I don't know, even all these years later. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. On Halloween night of 1957, 35-year-old Los Angeles hairstylist Peter Fabiano heard a knock at his front door. The evening had been a lively one, with groups of expectant trick-or-treaters knocking frequently after sunset. But this particular visitor had arrived just after 11 p.m., long after any child should have been roaming the streets. Peter had been lying in bed with his wife when they'd heard the knock at the door, and although the disturbance irritated him, he knew the quick dispensation of a treat was preferable to the receiving of a trick. Peter's wife, Betty, later said that she heard her husband walk down the stairs to open their front door before telling the caller, "It's a little late, isn't it?" Betty had expected to hear a child's voice in response. Instead, she heard the reply of a grown woman. "Not too late for this," Betty heard, with the words followed by a loud gunshot. When she rushed to her husband's side, Betty found Peter bleeding to death at the bottom of their staircase, and sadly, despite being rushed to the nearby Sun Valley Hospital, Peter was pronounced dead on arrival. The sudden death of her husband shattered the young Betty Fabiano, who felt as if her entire world had come crashing down around her. Instead of a bright future, loving husband, and a happy home, all that remained were her two burning questions. Who would possibly want to murder her husband, and why would they want him dead? Police quickly discovered that the only witness to the shooting was a lone teenager who saw a car speeding away from the neighborhood shortly after 11 p.m. Given that there was no valuables missing from the affluent Fabiano home, police speculated the motive for the murder was some kind of personal grievance, while the lack of any shell casing at the scene suggested the fatal shot had come from a small caliber revolver. Upon reading through Peter Fabiano's criminal history, police officers discovered that he'd been picked up on a charge of illegal bookmaking back in 1948. Since most illegal gambling operations came under the wing of organized crime, some officers began to suspect that Fabiano's murder was a gangland execution. Betty Fabiano insisted that her husband had severed his connections to the illegal gambling circuit and had made his fortune running a series of legitimate beauty salons. Yet when asked if Peter might have any enemies, Betty was given pause for thought. In her opinion, there was one woman who hated her husband so much that she might consider killing him, and her name was Joan Rabel. Born in the city of Philadelphia in 1917, Joan grew up to carve out a lucrative career as a writer and photographer. During Joan's early 30s, a whirlwind romance led to a fairy tale wedding, but sadly, the marriage wasn't to last. The divorce was a vicious one, so rather than fight it out, Joan picked up sticks and moved to Los Angeles in 1957. Joan hoped that she might find a home among the city's world-famous creative industry, but in the meantime, she needed a job, and one day, she happened to be passing a hair salon with a help wanted sign in the window. A hair salon owned by none other than Peter Fabiano. It was through working at Peter Fabiano's hair salon that Joan Rabel met his wife, Betty. The two women had a lot in common and were said to share a wicked sense of humor, so it's no surprise that the pair were fast friends. But over the course of the following few months, Betty and Joan's friendship blossomed to the point where Joan was almost one of the family. Then, when the Fabianos began to experience trouble in their marriage, Joan was a natural choice of temporary roommate for an increasingly bereft Betty. Peter was understandably upset that his marriage was on the rocks, but he assumed that Joan's interest in Betty was merely platonic. The reality couldn't have been further from the truth. At some point during Betty's stay with Joan, her host had made some kind of confession. It must have been difficult to phrase during such a deeply conservative decade, and it's not clear exactly how Joan chose to explain it, but she told Betty that she was a lesbian and that she was in love with her. It was a huge gamble for Joan, but unfortunately for her, it didn't pay off. Betty didn't reciprocate her feelings, and the confession appears to be the catalyst for Betty giving her husband another chance. Upon returning to Peter, Betty was made a promise that she'd never see Joan again, and when informed of the decision to go no contact, Joan was devastated. Yet Betty wasn't the only friend Joan made that year. For a number of months, Joan had been meeting with a woman named Goldine Pizer, who had recently come out as a lesbian following the divorce of her husband, and after listening to Joan's tales of romantic woe, Goldine came up with a chillingly psychopathic solution to her new friend's problem. She decided that Peter Fabiano had to die. The way Goldine saw it, the grief of losing her husband would drive Betty Fabiano directly into Joan's arms, with nothing to keep them apart. Many have suggested that the idea was implanted into Goldine's mind by a deeply manipulative Joan, but the fact remains that it was one that she was deeply committed to. Just days after listening to Joan's story of heartbreak, Goldine drove over to a sporting goods store in Pasadena, where she purchased a .38 revolver under the pretense of requiring personal protection. Then on Halloween night, Goldine drove Joan over to the Fabiano house to give her a front row seat for Peter's execution. Joan later told the police that Goldine disposed of the gun in a Los Angeles department store, and following the recovery of the murder weapon, law enforcement moved to arrest their suspect. When police officers arrested Goldine in her Hollywood apartment, she reportedly told them, "It's a relief to get this off my mind." After being declared fit to stand trial, Goldine told a judge, "I had no motive personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was always easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." One psychiatrist who took the stand appeared to take pity on Goldine and seemed to confirm that Joan Rabel had subjected her to a despicable level of emotional manipulation. Initially, both women pled not guilty to all charges, but while Goldine was eventually convinced to plead insanity, Joan Rabel refused to comment throughout her hearing and was said to wear an eerie, constant smile during the trial. After the court was convinced of Joan's intimate involvement in the murder of Peter Fabiano, Joan joined Goldine in being convicted by the jury. Yet bizarrely, instead of first-degree murder, both women received convictions in the second degree. Such a decision seemed inexplicable in light of how cold and deliberate Peter Fabiano's murder was, but it comes with a degree of nuance. Having considered the level of manipulation she was subjected to, the jury weren't willing to convict Goldine of a crime befitting a cold-blooded killer, and even though she hadn't pulled the trigger, the jury believed Joan deserved to be jailed for so heavily encouraging Peter's execution. The sentences handed out to the women were designed to reflect this nuance, as both were sentenced to 5 years to life imprisonment. Goldine Pizer was eventually released, and she chose to stay in the greater Los Angeles area until she died at 83 in 1998. Considerably less information exists pertaining to Joan Rabels, but it's generally assumed that she was released from prison around the same time as Goldine. Betty Fabiano ended up selling the beauty empire created by her husband and lived the rest in relative comfort in Palm Desert, California, until she passed away in 1999. Her passing marked the end of a woman who was barely out of her 30s when the love of her life was stolen away from her, a tragedy that was engineered by a woman who she'd once called a friend. On Halloween night of 1994, 7-year-old Tony Bagley was intensely excited to head out on his first real trick-or-treating adventure. For his costume, Tony had chosen to dress up as a skeleton, and once he was looking suitably spooky, he accompanied his mother, aunt, and 10-year-old sister out onto Engelstad Street in his hometown of Las Vegas. At around 6:15 p.m., the family found themselves near the intersection of Cheyenne and MLK, when suddenly, a man wearing a hooded sweatshirt and dark-colored joggers ran out into the street. The man appeared to look around for a few seconds before his gaze became fixed on the Bagley family. Then, to their absolute horror, the hooded man pulled out a pistol before opening fire on the terrified family. At the time the shooter commenced firing, the street was packed with costumed children and their accompanying parents, and chaos erupted as the multitudes of trick-or-treaters were running for cover. When the firing ceased, a speeding vehicle pulled up alongside the gunman, who jumped into the back seat before the car raced away. One by one, the terrified onlookers emerged from their hiding places to witness a truly traumatizing sight. All 4 members of the Bagley family were lying on the asphalt, with each one soaked in blood from the gunshot wounds they'd suffered. Tony's 10-year-old sister was rushed into emergency surgery after it was discovered her liver had been damaged while Tony's mother and aunt suffered wounds to her chest and leg respectively. Little Tony, on the other hand, had been shot in the head. He was placed on life support, and despite hospital staff doing everything in their power to save him, he later died as a result of his injuries. Local law enforcement made an urgent appeal for information, but despite a great deal of public outrage, only a handful of witnesses came forward to identify Tony's killer. They said the shooter was an African-American male in his late teens or early 20s and was around 5 foot 8 inches tall. The eyewitness statements led to the arrest of several suspects, most of which were involved in gang activity, but sadly, there was never enough evidence to solidly identify them as having taken Tony's life. Upon learning of Tony's tragic death, casino executive Bob Stupak offered a $100,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest, and Tony's murder went on to be featured on the nationally circulated TV show America's Most Wanted. However, despite a fresh wave of public fury, not a single person came forward with any pertinent information, and the case eventually went cold. Some suggested that the Bagley family were involved in narcotic sales in the area, and the shooting was revenge for a drug deal gone wrong. Yet many close to the family insisted that they were innocent of such activities, and that any link to organized crime was down to mistaken identity. 4 years later, Tony's father was arrested and eventually convicted over the murder of a man named Curtis Henry. Curtis was a degenerate gambler, and by 1998, he had accrued such a vast debt among underground loan sharks that he was greenlit for execution. Somehow, the task fell to Tony's father, who was later described as an angry, evil person by his victim's mother after a courtroom heard how he bragged of the murder. The father's illegal activities had somehow evaded the attention of law enforcement during the initial round of investigations, and a series of related theories began to emerge as a result. Even though Tony's father wasn't a part of his family's lives, it didn't mean his gangland rivals wouldn't target them for reprisals. Las Vegas homicide detectives later visited Tony's father while in custody, seeking to question him in relation to his son's murder. Yet the man himself refused any kind of police cooperation, and it was impossible for them to rekindle the search for Tony's killer. Some even speculated that the whole debt collection killing was merely a cover for Tony's father seeking revenge against his killer, and that the reason he refused to cooperate with the police is because he knew for certain that justice had been meted out. Yet without any concrete answers or familial cooperation, it's unlikely that the whole truth will ever see the light of day. Until that day, Tony Bagley's murder will remain unsolved, and the memory of a brief but happy life will forever be overshadowed by his cruel and senseless slaying. On the night of October 31st, 1969, 16-year-old Patty Spencer had arranged to join 15-year-old friend Pamela Hobley and her family for a round of trick-or-treating in their small hometown of Oscoda, Michigan. Yet at the last minute, there was a change of plan. Pamela told her mother that she and Patty wouldn't be joining them for trick-or-treating and would instead be attending a Halloween party hosted by a high school friend. Patty's mother implored her daughter to not stay out too late, then busied herself helping her 3 young daughters to prepare for their costumes for the evening. Little did she know, it was the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. A few hours later, Pam Hobley's mother received a telephone call from her daughter's boyfriend. Pam's boyfriend wanted to know if she left for the party yet, and when her mother informed him that she departed hours ago, both became very concerned. Pam's mother then telephoned Patty Spencer's mother, and after the pair conducted a brief preliminary search, they realized their daughters had gone missing. The police were informed and an investigation into the girls' disappearance commenced, with officers looking to build a picture of the girls' last known whereabouts. A number of eyewitnesses stated that the girls were last seen walking near Oscoda High School, yet a man later came forward to state that the girls had been hitchhiking and that he'd given them a ride from River Road into downtown Oscoda. That was quite a distance from the location of the party they were supposed to be attending, and despite law enforcement's efforts to uncover a reason, the motive behind their sudden detour remains a mystery. As the investigation progressed, detectives found themselves transfixed with two specific details of the case. The first was that neither Patty nor Pamela wore purses with them when they left for the party that night. According to their mothers, the girls went everywhere with their purses, as their entire lives were tucked inside. This struck investigators as odd, and suggested that wherever the two girls went that evening was somewhere they didn't feel 100% safe. The second detail was that in the weeks before her disappearance, Pam Hobley had brought up the possibility of meeting a friend from the northern town of Flint. Some have suggested this person is connected to the girls' disappearance, but not only have they never been identified, but Pamela's sister, Mary Burley, expressed her doubts that the Flint lead would be fruitful. Desperate for answers, Pamela's family posted a $1,000 reward for any information to locate Pamela or to bring any possible murderer to police custody. But despite the hefty sum, no promising tips came in from the general public. As the years passed and the case grew colder and colder, some investigators suspected that the girls might have been early victims of the Oakland County child killer. It was something of a shot in the dark, as the Oakland County child killer had operated primarily between February of 1976 and March of 1977, yet even skeptics found similarities between the cases to be chilling. The general consensus remained that the two girls had been abducted and murdered by whoever they had gone to meet, or by someone they'd chosen to hitchhike with. But for all intent and purpose, it was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. The heartbroken families of the two missing girls had to wait until 1985 for a break in the case, when an anonymous tipster reported that Patty and Pam were buried near a barn, one noted for its popularity as a teenage party spot. This tipster also reported that the girls' killers had been two local men, although they didn't know the exact names of those responsible. Police moved quickly to conduct a search of the area, but despite the use of highly trained cadaver dogs, there was no evidence that any human remains were buried in the barn's vicinity. Shortly afterwards, the police discovered that a second man had given the two girls a ride after they'd been spotted in downtown Oscoda. This man's reluctance to answer questions, in combination with his hesitance to approach the police, made him a major suspect in the case. If the police estimated timeline of events was correct, the man was the last person to see the girls alive. But despite an extensive investigation into his lifestyle and whereabouts, there was no concrete evidence that he'd taken the girls' lives. In the years that followed, Pam's sister Mary had continued to raise awareness of the case and had campaigned for it to be reopened and re-examined. She is a regular at the annual charity event known as Missing in Michigan, where family members of missing Michigan residents work alongside detectives to share details of such cases. Both Patty and Pam have been entered into a number of national databases, including the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who used a technique known as age progression to illustrate an estimated likeness of how the pair could look if they were still alive. These images were circulated in the early 2010s, but unfortunately, they didn't yield any fresh leads. A new detective was assigned to the case in 2010, and they proceeded to conduct fresh interviews with the case's witnesses in the hopes of generating new information. This new effort appeared to have led to the 2013 announcement that the police had a new person of interest in the case, but ultimately, they needed more information for the investigation to continue. As time goes on, it's increasingly unlikely that Patty and Pamela's disappearance will ever be solved. Physical evidence can be preserved, but the memories of potential witnesses cannot. If there is indeed an eyewitness account that could crack the case wide open, there's an ever-increasing chance it'll go to the grave with them. Michigan State Police simply haven't had the right resources at the right times to really make any steady progress, and combined with the soul-crushing bad luck the investigation seems to have faced, it's doubtful that the final moments of Patty and Pamela's lives will ever be pieced together.
Alright, so check this out. It was my turn to take the kids trick-or-treating. The previous year it was my wife's, and we trade back and forth every year. My son and daughter are aged 7 and 9. Usually, I stay on the street while my kids go up to different houses to collect candy. After about half an hour of walking around, we came to one of the more popular hotspots for candy collecting, a main street in the neighborhood. Lots of really cool decorations and animatronics on people's lawns, so I became a bit distracted and stopped watching my kids closely. At one point, they came back from a house accompanied by another girl about the same height as my daughter. She was wearing a weird homemade mask, like a cardboard cutout or something. My daughter asked me if she could trick or treat with us, so I said sure, and we carried on together as a group. I didn't know who this girl was, but I figured she was a friend from school, and as we continued, I started to notice a large man trailing us. He was wearing some sort of angry cat mask. It was kinda creepy, to be honest. I thought that maybe he was the father of the girl, so I tried to start up some small chit-chat with him. I said something like, "Hey, nice weather, right?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me while our kids went up the stairs to the next house. I tried again. I said, "Hey, is that your daughter?" He nodded, but didn't say anything. I figured he just wasn't in the mood for chatting, so I stopped trying. We carried on for another 15 minutes until suddenly my kids came up to me and said that they wanted to go home. This surprised me as we hadn't been out for too long and their bags were only about a third of the way full. In any case, I agreed, waved goodbye at the man in the cat mask and his daughter, and started on our way home. The weird thing is that when I glanced back at the man and his daughter, they were just standing there, still staring at us. I checked one more time as we turned the corner and they were still standing there, not having moved at all. At this point, I decided to ask my kids, "So, who was that girl?" My daughter looked up at me with a confused look on her face. "She's your friend," my daughter replied, and I asked her what she meant. Apparently, the girl with the cardboard mask approached them and said she was a friend of mine. She told my daughter she was too shy to ask me if she could join us to trick or treat and wanted my daughter to ask me instead. I laughed at this story and replied to my daughter, "Why would you think she was my friend? I don't have any children friends." What my daughter said next chilled my bones. According to her, when the girl with the cardboard mask approached them for the first time, she wasn't wearing the mask, so they were able to see her face. As it turns out, she wasn't a girl at all, but an older woman around my age with wrinkles on her face. And what's even more disturbing, the old woman had started to steal treats from my daughter's bag, apparently when I wasn't looking. This is why they asked me to go home. The old woman was creeping them out, and they wanted just to get away from her. I brought my kids home, and I told my wife what happened. We made sure to check through all of their candy, but we didn't find anything suspicious or off. We didn't call the police or anything since nothing really happened, but thinking back, I kind of regret that decision now. What the heck was that old woman doing? And who was that man following us around? I don't think I'll ever know. I just think it's sick that there are people out there on Halloween hiding behind masks, pretending to be children.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Daddy, chill.